Hey guys, Justin here from Jay's Modern Bushcraft and Survival, and today I wanted to cover everything you need to know to make your first friction fire, or even if you've done this before, hopefully some of this information will help you. Okay, so one thing I wanted to do different in this video than a lot of the videos that I've seen on YouTube. There's a lot of great videos out there on creating friction fires. I'm going to focus mostly on a bow drill fire. Reason being is that I feel that's a great way to start to learn friction fires in general. You have a good mechanical advantage. You're not going to, create a bunch of blisters on your hands trying to do a hand drill. So in my opinion, it's a good place to start. What I wanted to do differently is really go into detail about where to begin with this method, because a lot of the videos that I've seen, they go into a lot of detail about, the proper technique and, what needs to happen to create that ember. But I want to go more into the beginning of this process, like selecting the right wood, getting the right materials together, because that, in my opinion, is, well, it technically is where you have to start. I mean, before you can worry about your technique or anything like that, you have to get the pieces and materials of this set. You need to create the set, and you need to make sure that you have the right materials to do that. So that's what I'm going to cover today. First off, let's start with what you would need to get this done. First thing you're going to need is a knife. Make sure you got a knife that you can whittle some lumber with, or whittle some wood with. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. Another nice item to have would be a small saw. Like if you had a Swiss Army blade, Swiss Army knife with one of those little saws on it, that would be great. But even if only what you have is a knife, you should be able to do this with just a knife. The next things you're going to need are the materials to craft the set itself. You're going to need, well, four main things to complete the set. You're going to need a hearth board. You're going to need a spindle that drills into that. You're going to need a bearing block to put weight on that spindle to drive it downward and create that pressure and friction as it spins. And you're going to need a stick to act as a bow. I just want to point out, you do not need a curved stick. Let me show you something. Okay, so here's what I'll be using as my bow. And this is the spindle I'll be using to demonstrate this. Now, you don't need a curved stick. This one happens to be slightly curved. However, when you put the spindle in there, you can put it in so that it's on the outside of the string. So even if you were using a straight stick, it wouldn't matter. So you can use a straight stick for this. Having a bow in it, I don't know, maybe it helps make it look pretty, but it's not necessary. It does not need a curve. So the most important thing when it comes to the actual stick that you're using for the bow itself, just make sure that it's a stiff dry wood stick. You don't want it to bow or flex in any way. And when it comes to the length of that stick, generally you want it about the length from, your armpit to your fingertip, like that. Because you want to be able to get a full stroke out of this when you're spinning the spindle. So just get something the right length, about an inch in width. You don't want it too thin because it can break, and you don't want it too thick because then the tip is going to be, as it's extended, that tip will get heavy and it will tend to droop as you get tired, and you will get tired, especially when you're first learning this. So pick something appropriate. Speaking of the bow, one of the most important things that you really need is a good cordage. On the bow that I showed you, you can see the cord that I have, it's 550 paracord. Now, I use that because it's very strong, it's very durable. It can deal with, a good amount of friction and not break, because that string is going to be under a lot of stress and a lot of tension. And also it's going to have to deal with some friction, because a lot of times, you might get some slippage with that string. And so you want it to be as durable as possible. Now, I want you to understand, this is a video on learning how to do a friction fire. And when you're learning, I had people, when I was talking about doing it, they would joke around and be like, hey, that's not, natural cordage. No. But even the people that use natural cordage on their bows, what did they carve the spindle out of in the hearth board? Did they use, a stone knife that they chipped away at with rocks to create, No, they probably used a manufactured steel knife. So don't get hung up on stuff like that. Just worry about getting down the technique, getting down and learning the interactions between the different woods, what needs to happen to create the friction, getting down the mechanics, of your body and your technique, and actually just get a ember. It's going to build your confidence, and it's going to give you a lot of knowledge towards if you ever had to do this, from scratch in the wild or something. I say always carry a lighter, but this is a good skill to know and have. And once you understand one friction fire, you can understand, like, for example, like if you understand the bow drill method, you can understand how it relates, if to a hand drill or a fire plow, or, other different types of friction fire. I figured I should also briefly cover how I attached the string to this piece of stick. The reason I chose this stick is because you can see it has this little fork in it at the top. And I did that because, at least on one end, it makes it very easy to attach that string. Without that, it makes it a little bit more difficult to attach your string to it. I just simply tied what's called a prusik loop in the end of this string. It drapes over top here. I mean, you can see the string does not need to be super tight. Before I do my demonstration, I am going to tighten this up slightly because it is a little bit loose. However, on this end, I did carve a notch in this wood. You can see that notch there that I carved, and that's so that the string does not slide down in that direction towards the other end of the stick. All I did for this end was I wrapped it around twice and tied a basic slip knot. It's always good to know your knots, so learn your knots, practice them. Carry paracord, take your bootlaces out, replace them with paracord. That length of paracord, it could make a fire for you if you have it. Because honestly, out of the whole bow drill set, the cordage, I would say, is probably the most difficult thing to manufacture out of, like in a primitive way out of natural materials. The cordage is going to always be the most difficult. You can do it out of bark, spruce roots, whatever, pieces of shirts and clothing, but the fact is that string is going to break a lot. The second and most difficult piece of a bow drill set, and if you have paracord, it will be the most difficult piece, is the bearing block. Now, this is just a piece of wood that you're going to hold in your hand, and you're going to apply pressure downward. Now, it has a divot in it right here, and that's where the spindle will rotate and spin. What I did in order to get my first fire was I put a piece of an aluminum can in there. So this brings me back to what I was kind of saying, where you might not have, all the materials that you need on hand to make this set, but with a little improvisation and working with what you have, you can still get a friction fire. The last thing I wanted to mention was wood selection. When you're selecting wood for your kit, I could tell you right now, cedar is great. I could tell you willow is great. Tulip poplar works great. All of those trees can be found in the eastern woodlands. If you're in different parts of the globe, different, trees are going to be available to you, different types of woods, but you don't need to know that. And what I mean is that you don't need to know or be able to identify these types of trees. What you need to do is be able to identify the properties that you need. And the more you experiment with this, the better you're going to get at that. For example, for your whole set, except for the bearing block, the most important thing is that the wood is dry. Dry, dry, dry. I've seen people that have made hundreds of bow drill fires, and they get some marginal, wood that's got a little bit of moisture in it, and they work at it for hours and hours and end up failing. So it's very important to get dry wood for at least your spindle and your hearth board. When it comes to your bearing block, you want the opposite. Like I said, I didn't have access to that stuff when I was trying to do this. I couldn't get it. So you want a resinous, or at the very least, the green wood. And that way, your spindle can spin without friction. And if you don't have that, grab a tube of chapstick and rub that on the end of the spindle where you don't want the friction, and lubricate it. Stick the end of the spindle in your ear, and or get some earwax on it. Anything you can do. Rub it on your nose if you got some oil on your skin. Anything to lubricate that end of the spindle and reduce that friction is going to make your lives a lot easier. Like I said, once you have that cordage worked out, that bearing block is the most difficult thing to really get right. Now, this is a little trick I heard about. I basically just took a piece of an aluminum soda can and I inserted it into this bearing block. So I created the divot in that bearing block. The problem is, here's my spindle, okay? Now, that point is a lot smaller than the end that's actually going to be drilling into your hearth board or fireboard. That point is going to get hotter before the end where you're actually trying to create the friction and the fire, which means a lot of times it's very easy to end up shouldering out, burning into this bearing block to the point where it's too difficult to work the spindle to even create enough friction on this end. So that's why this little piece of aluminum can make a big difference when you simply place it inside there. Alternatively, for this video, I have this device which I'm going to use. You can get these items relatively cheap. They have a socket that is actually metal, high carbon steel, and you can use that as a bearing block. And these are a great tool to have, in my opinion. Not that you want to, in my opinion, not that you want to start a friction fire, if you don't have to. However, they're also great as a method of doing flint and steel. You can strike flint off of that. You can also use this to strike a ferro rod because it's got very sharp 90-degree corners or edges. So you can use that to strike a ferro rod very effectively as well. So this one device gives you 3 different ways to start fire just in itself. But yes, if you don't have anything like this, resin wood or fat wood works great. I went through many of these bearing blocks, burned right through them with the tip of the spindle to the point where they were unusable. It took me, like I said, it took a week. This is very difficult to, produce and, have it actually work well. But green wood, resin wood, something I didn't have access to, but I did have access to a soda can. When you're selecting the woods or the type of wood for your hearthboard and your spindle, in this case, you want softer woods, lighter woods. What I'm going to be using is cedar. The best way, like what I was saying, was you want to identify the properties in the wood that make it good for a bow drill or friction fire. And the best way to test a type of wood is to kind of take your fingernail and just kind of jab it with your fingernail. And if you can leave an indentation in that wood without, really bending your fingernail, that's a softer wood. So that should work. But then again, I've seen people make bow drill fires out of oak. So it's more, like I said, about being dry than it is about, having the perfect species of wood or trees. It's got to be dry. But softwoods do make it a lot easier. Cedar, I've heard people say you can almost get an ember out of this by accident. And honestly, if you have a good bearing block, a well lubricated, good bearing block where you're not getting friction here at the top of the spindle, I can attest this set is all cedar, and it's actually quite easy compared to how hard I've worked at other woods. In any case, enough talking head. Let's actually get out there and get a fire. And with any luck, I'll succeed. Before we get started, let's talk about this spindle real quick. Like I said, I made this out of cedar. You want this end of the spindle, which is going to be the top, to look kind of like a dull pencil. You don't want it, sharp. And then the other end, it's going to be quite a bit more blunt. And that's the end that's going to drill into the hearthboard. It's not really complicated. Try to get it as straight and as round as possible. And I like to keep it a little bit thicker than the thickness of my thumb. This one, as you can see, is a little bit more narrow. But I always like to make them fatter because you can always take more material away.
And a little trick as well, if it's wide, you can narrow down the center here. And what that will do, it's almost like the gears on a car. It's like putting it into a lower gear. The narrower the center is, the more rotations you'll get for each stroke with that bow. So you can have a wide drill end and have the center slightly more narrow, and you'll get more rotations for the same amount of effort. But it will become harder to spin, so it's a trade-off. So it's something you're going to have to experiment with. Also, as far as the length of the spindle, picture like if you go like this with your thumb and pinky. Like this one, for example, is actually a little short. You know, a little longer would be better, but I burnt quite a bit of it away because this is a soft wood. And as you're grinding it into the hearthboard, you're not only grinding away the hearthboard, but you're also grinding away the spindle. And some things can happen, like this end can get kind of polished, in which case it won't work too well and you'll need to kind of re-carve it slightly. This is an example of an untouched hearthboard so far. You just want to kind of shave it down so it's a little, flat, because you don't want this rocking back and forth, as you're trying to work the bow drill. You want it to lay relatively flat. You'll have your foot on it, kind of like this when you're doing it. So you'll be able to hold it down, but if it's rounded, it will still rock. So just basically get a flat piece of wood, and that's what we're going to start with. And then once I'm going to explain how to do the burn-in process and everything, but I'm going to make a new hole because as you can see, this one, it's already, halfway burnt through the wood. So we'll make a new hole. We'll start with this hearthboard and we'll work from there.